Hey everybody, I'm Bill Calkins with Ball Tech on Demand, and we're back with another installment of In the Break Room, an entire month of short educational sessions intended to help you get prepared to grow your best crop ever next spring. Fall is a critical period in every greenhouse. It's kind of like spring training where you tune up your greenhouse and get ready for product to start arriving and to start growing. So we've selected 9 topics to cover this month, one for each Tuesday and Thursday, and hopefully you're taking some time each day to grab your phone, your tablet, your laptop, head to the break room, grab a bite to eat, and hear from Ball Tech On Demand experts. Today's topic has been in many discussions amongst growers for a few years, and it's going to be great to get some definitive information from someone as experienced as Dr. Todd Cavins. The topic is impatiens. And we're going to call this Impatiens 2.0 because we've done a lot of research and a lot of trialing. All the different breeding companies across the industry are working on this product, the folks that produce Impatiens. And we've learned a lot over the last few years since Impatiens Downy Mildew reared its ugly head. There's been a lot of research and trialing as well as new breeding for high resistant genetics. And Todd's going to cover this in a very quick and concise way, but there's going to be a lot of really good information. So I'm going to step back in a minute and let him take it away. But real quick, before we get started, all of the videos and webinars that have been recorded and presented during this series are going to be posted at growertalks.com/tech-on-demand. In fact, there's a handful up there already. There's vegetative propagation, seed propagation, watering, photo period, and there's a lot more to come. So that's enough out of me. Todd, why don't you share your screen and take it away and help the growers out there produce the best impatiens crops that they can.
Okay, everybody. Well, hey, the reason we wanted to discuss with you Impatiens 2.0 is because we're kind of having to relearn how to grow Impatiens again. As Bill mentioned, oh man, it's been at least a decade ago, Impatiens Downy Mildew kind of just came in and slugged us, you're right? And Impatiens were not successful in the landscape, which means we quit growing them. But, Impatiens are coming back. We'll talk about why they're coming back, and we'll talk about what we need to do to make sure we have the top crop out there. So let's relearn or remind ourselves how to grow Impatiens. Whoa. Okay. Impatiens are back. Photo, for those of you in front of your computer, you see that photo, top right-hand side. This was a great sign to walk through greenhouses this spring and see Impatiens in color. I mean, that's why we love them. It's one of our best color products in the shade. Important, important, important. But, as I mentioned, about 10 years ago, if you look at those photos on the bottom, we started seeing this disease roll in, and it's Impatiens Downy Mildew. Now, we won't go into a tremendous amount of detail about that disease. We're going to talk about what we need to do in the production, in the growing facility to make sure we manage that. But, oftentimes we saw some plants show up a little, foliage starts to yellow a little bit. And in the landscape, we ended up with just skeletons of plants. But, thanks to some new introductions from Pan American Seed introduced the Beacon series of Impatiens, and then Syngenta introduced Amara XDR. These are the Impatiens walleriana, who are historically extremely susceptible to Impatiens Downy Mildew, but these are more and highly resistant to that disease. So what does that mean? That means we can produce these again. Our consumers can have that rock solid color in the shade. Okay, so a little bit of caution, and this is kind of what we saw this year. A lot of folks got really excited. They brought in some of the Beacon, they brought in some of the Amara, and they had a bunch of other varieties. Maybe they're Imprezas or they're Super Elfins, maybe some double Impatiens in there. But you know what? It's in Impatiens walleriana, it's the Beacon and Amara that we need to concentrate on because they're the safer ones to produce. Doesn't mean they're completely immune, but they're a lot safer and a lot less likely to be affected by this disease. Other varieties you're pretty safe with, the hybrid Impatiens like the Sun Patiens and Bounce, the New Guinea Impatiens, those are okay to grow as well. It's these Impatiens walleriana that we really need to select a disease-resistant series. Now, just because we have a fix or a help with one disease, don't forget about the other big conditions that can affect Impatiens. The one that comes to my mind is Impatiens necrotic spot virus, or INSV. That's transmitted or vectored by thrips. So, to think about that disease management, we have to think about pest management, we have to think about sanitation. We're going to have another talk here in the next few sessions about sanitation more in depthly, so stay tuned for that. I'll also ask Bill to post some other information where we've talked about sanitation in the past, but it is critical, critical, critical to pest and disease management, so keep that in mind. Let's talk about Impatiens Downy Mildew just a little bit more, and then we'll get into producing impatiens. But I want to talk about reducing your risk, okay? And like I said, you really should be growing a high-resistant variety like the Beacons, or the series like the Beacon. It is your safest, it's the most safe method you're going to have, okay? If you have some of the others out there, they can bring that disease, are much more susceptible. That disease could transfer over to the high resistant series. The high resistant series may not die, but those others, they could be, vector that in there or bring that in there. It could be a problem. Okay. So if you're growing the vegetative impatiens, things like the Fiestas or maybe the Rockapolcos, those are Impatiens walleriana, double impatiens. Those are highly susceptible as well, okay? You really should grow anything that's highly susceptible to this disease in a separate greenhouse from your resistant varieties. Again, it just makes sense. You're gonna, reduce your risk by growing them separately. So it's a pretty good plan to have. Another really good plan to have is, even if you are growing the resistant varieties, you need to have a rigorous integrated pest management program. Okay, this is sanitation, this is scouting, this is preventative sprays, this is curative sprays, introducing the appropriate biological controls. So have a rigorous program. Speaking of that, one of the things that you probably ought to do with impatiens is have preventative fungicides. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but in previous webinars, Will Healy and Ball Technical Services with me went really in depth with this guideline you see over here on the right, Impatiens Downy Mildew Guidelines for Growers. You can find that on our Ball Seed website. We'll also post links to it in the show notes here as well. But he went really into depth about different types of chemistry. So we all know it's good to rotate, right? But through this exercise with Impatiens Downy Mildew, we've been watching and learning from the past few years. We've learned that, chemical applications just aren't chemical applications. You need to have the right chemical. You need to think about whether you're spraying or drenching it, because as I have here in one of the notes, we found the same chemical that could be labeled as a spray or used as a drench actually gave us better longevity when it was drenched, okay? We need to think about, is it contact, or is it systemic, or locally systemic, or translaminar? All those have an effect on how and when you should apply them. For instance, a contact chemical, a fungicide, may kill, what's right there active on the existing leaves. But as new leaves unfold and grow each week in impatiens production, the new plant, the new tissue leaves won't be protected if you had just previously used a contact fungicide. So do your homework on that, check into that webinar, and get yourself really educated about that and building your arsenal, because you really do need an arsenal for this particular crop. All right. Part of disease management when it comes to Impatiens Downy Mildew, and it comes to any disease, the pathologists talk about the disease triangle, where you have the host, you have the pathogen, and you have the environment, okay? It takes all three to have a disease really become a problem for us. So one of the things we can also do as growers is not just have a good fungicide rotation, but let's talk about our environment as well, okay? We want to reduce the humidity in our crop when we can. So reducing your relative humidity to below 80% is critical, okay? Some of the things, so that means probably some natural ventilation or some heat to drive off your crop. But of course, that means managing other things that affect growth with that. So you've got to think about that holistically. You also want to avoid wet conditions, especially late in the day or at night. And what this means is there's no late day irrigations. When we water late in the day, the plants go into the evening time. When the temperatures cool a little bit, that means the relative humidity actually increases as temperatures decrease. We get more free moisture, we get disease conditions. So do not water late in the day. Make sure your plants are going into the evening time, the nighttime on the drier side. We'd want to irrigate in the morning, not the evening. So try to implement that strategy. Another really good thing we can do is just get good air circulation. You know, growing flat tight in packs, well, that's kind of what we have to do. But that means as soon as that canopy comes in, we should be having our program set up where we can move that crop readily or get better airflow movement through there through horizontal airflow fans or some type of movement, natural ventilation, or if we can, space a crop. Okay, so those are things we can do to help control the environment to make the disease less susceptible. All right, so that's kind of it on Impatiens Downy Mildew. Now let's get into talking about actually producing the crop. There are the vegetative double varieties, but again, we're concentrating on high resistance series from seed today. So seed quality, fresh is best, okay? So what I want to encourage you to do, that's one of the things we pride ourselves on here at Ball Seed, is providing fresh tested seed. A couple of the things we test for is vigor, because good plant vigor, seed vigor gives us a nice uniform crop, makes it much easier to manage and grow and send out the door in great shape. So at Ball Seed, we do the Ball Vigor Index. And there's a number on there, and I wouldn't get too caught up in the number. The higher the better, but we're never going to send anything out the door that doesn't meet our specifications, where you have a nice uniform crop. So keep that in mind. Look at your Ball Vigor Index and make sure that you got those high numbers. And again, we won't ship you anything low, but it's one step we go above and beyond what a lot of folks do. Okay. Another thing, often right on the label, as you see here, you see in the big bold print down towards the bottom, the germination test. You can see this particular variety, which was Impatiens Beacon Red Bright, 99% germination rate. That's one of the good things about Impatiens. They're one that tend to germ pretty well, so this is one that most growers can germ on their own and be pretty successful for. Will you get 99%? Maybe not. Should you get 95% if it says 99? You can. So that's something to look for, is what is that germination? So what can you expect? How many seeds do you need to sow so that you get your numbers right for your sales plan? So let's talk about, what does it take to germinate and get that 99%? It's water management, water management, water management. And whether you look at the guidelines for the Impatiens Amara XDR or look at the ones from Beacon, one of the things you'll notice is that for the most part, you can summarize germination of Impatiens as hot and wet. Both of them recommend a very, very wet soil, and that's a saturation level or soil moisture level of 5. And remember, we've got lots of good webinars and information on this as well. On the 1 to 5 scale, 1 is bone dry, the plants are wilted, the soil is light brown, it's pulled away from the edge. 5 is the other end of the spectrum, where the soil is saturated. You can actually see a little free water in between some of the particles of peat moss. So that is really wet. That's where we need to be for Impatiens. And this is really critical for the first, say 5 to 7 days during that germination process. So think about, how am I going to maintain that moisture? During that time, we don't want the flats to be drying out. We want to get them nice and wet and try to keep them there at that saturation point, or at that moisture level 5. So for different folks, that means different things. For those of you that have germination chambers, that's great. If you have mist in there, you can keep that moisture up high. I've seen germination chambers that are actually dry. They're just warmer areas, and the growers wrap the carts or flats or tint them just to make sure that there's no moisture loss in that time. Okay. And you want to, again, maintain that till germination. Well, what's germination? That's a really good question. And what we often use out in the industry isn't what a lot of the scientists use. Germination is just the point where the seed comes out of the seed coat pretty much, but we can't see that really, right? So we tend to see the hook, which is the hypocotyl, which is the part of the plant stem, that first plant stem that's underneath the cotyledons, which is the first leaves that come out, those big fleshy leaves. So when we see that, we should see that emerge within 24 to 48 hours. For instance, a plug flat should have pretty uniform emergence of the hook or cotyledons. If you see that 24 to 48 hours, you get all the flat going that way, your moisture was correct. If you're seeing variability, let's go back and rethink about how you're managing the moisture during that first critical 5 to 7 days, okay? All right, I said hot and wet. So what do I mean by hot when it comes to germination? You know, most germination temperatures you see anywhere from 68 degrees, maybe some are down lower in 65 Fahrenheit, up to 75, 78, 80 degrees if you're talking about vinca. Well, beacon impatiens, all impatiens really like to germ at a pretty high temperature. So I'm going to say shoot for a minimum of 72 degrees to get the most optimum uniformity and rapid germination. Okay. The technical bulletins will go up higher even, and you can go higher. Is that practical for you? It may or may not be, but you're probably, to get these high temperatures, you're going to have bottom heat. You know, so if you're a larger greenhouse, we definitely see the heated floors being more and more popular these days. That's a great tool. If you're a smaller operation, you may look to using some of the heat mats or some other way to get the temperature of the soil nice and warm up to that 72 degrees. Not the air temperature, but the soil temperature is what we're talking about here. Okay. Also think about the water temperature that you're putting on. If you're misting your seeds to keep them nice and moist, how cool is that water going on? We have seen situations where definitely the air temperature, the soil temperature is nice and warm, but as we go in and mist over the top with cold water, we drop the temperature below optimum. So keep that in mind as a tip to look for to help ensure uniform germination. All right, so hot and wet. What's one other thing we need to look for? One of the things that can make impatiens a little bit unique compared to some crops is they need light for germination, okay? So this is where a strategy comes in. If you look at some of the technical bulletins out there from breeder companies, they'll say to cover your seed. The reason they're saying that is to trap in moisture. But you've got to cover in a way where you do not block the light, okay? So this is definitely not putting a plastic cover over the flat or anything like that, a dark one. This would maybe covering with coarse vermiculite, okay? And the reason I say coarse is because coarse vermiculite, it absorbs the water from a mist or irrigation and it traps the humidity right over the seed. But the coarse particle size allows light to kind of penetrate around the edges and corners, which are critical. So you don't want to cover your sowing, your flats, such as this particular picture. It's a little bit of a fine vermiculite particle and it's really dense. You can't even see the ridges on the plug flat. So that's definitely not what we want. Go with the larger and less dense covering than what you see in this particular picture. So those are three keys of how we're going to get fast uniform germination. Once we get that good germination, we've got all the cotyledons up, you know, nice uniform flat. We know we're going towards those first true leaves. So what do we think about then? We really need to think about what's our plan to grow these plants. What do we want them to look like? It starts right now, okay? Do you want a young plant such as a plug flat that's in flower when you're ready to transplant? Do you want one such as I have in the picture? You can see this particular plant flat of Super Elephant Impatiens. This is actually in a 432. It's a punchable tray. This is the one where we use the manual automated plug transplanter to push the plants through the bottom of the plug flat to transplant. It's a great tool for starting your automation process if you haven't already. But to do that, these plants need to be tight, they need to be toned so they can easily pass through the bottom of the plug flat without being damaged. So that's what I'm talking about. What's our plan? It starts right now, soon after germination, with managing the growth, okay? You know, and it really kind of, I mean, think about it. If you are also, what are you going to do when you transplant it? So if I'm going to transplant it into a pack material such as this, I want the plant small and compact with lots of flower buds, such as we see here, okay? That's going to affect how I'm growing these plants in the young plant stage. But what if I'm growing my plants to market like this? This is a 5 1/4 inch pot. It's a big, big canopy, not as much dense flowers on it compared to the pack material I showed you earlier. So we grew these a little bit different to achieve that. And so let's talk about managing the growth, getting tone growth with our water and fertilizer strategy and PGR strategy to get the particular one you need. Okay, I mentioned water management. Water management was key for germination. Well, guess what? I'm not going to get away from that mantra as we go into growth. Okay, we said to germinate, we wanted a soil level 5, really wet. Okay, But once we've got true leaves, actually, once we've got germinated, we've got that hook and cotyledon stage, we want to start thinking about drying the plants down, okay? Now, what does that mean? I mentioned one was, very dry, plants are wilted. Well, that's not where we want to go. We want to go to a level 2, which is just before that. So from this point on, we want to irrigate up to a 4 and dry down to a 2. That wet dry cycle gives us great root mass, okay? And if we want plants a little tighter, a little shorter, we can try to stay lower on that scale, okay? If we need the plants to grow a little bigger, such as in these containers here, we can add it or keep them a little bit more towards the wet side. So that's how you can really use water to change the shape and appearance of the impatiens. And we can do that because these are not a photoperiodic crop, right? These are day neutral. So it really matters how many leaves you're unfolding of when it's going to flower, okay? So after you get about 5 to 6, 7 to 8 true leaves, that's when you start to see those flower buds really pop out. That's a key indicator. So you can imagine how we can use water and fertilizer to grow a little bit more foliage, a little bit more internode length before we get those flowers starting to emerge. So think about that. Another key thing, do not go into the crop, do not go into the night with a wet crop. I mentioned this earlier for disease prevention. It's also for growth, okay? Plants grow and stretch at night. So if they are wet going into the night, they will stretch much more than a plant that goes into the night a little bit drier. So use that tool, no late irrigations, especially to help keep your plant growth toned. One other tip, and this is going to play into nutrition as well, but this is where we have that nice little marriage of water management, nutrition, and PGR. But when you irrigate, now I'm going to show you a picture of a lupin here because it's one I had a good picture of, but we want to watch out for this scenario here where we get a water droplet that stays on the growing tip, okay? Water on the growing tip stops evapotranspiration or water uptake and movement through the plant. And that's going to lead us into some problems that we're going to talk about on the nutrition side, but often it can be induced by irrigation practices, maybe not using good circulation to dry the foliage off. I've got some growers that actually have used leaf blowers to blow water off the tips. I've got some growers that actually bump their trays or their bench a little bit to get this water to shed off. So let's talk about the other side of that now, which is nutrition management. If we talk about nutrition management just in general, okay, we're going to say that impatiens are a light feeder. They don't need a lot of nitrogen. They don't need a lot of phosphorus. In fact, when we give them excess amounts, we get excess growth, usually not too desirable. So a light feed is kind of what we often talk about, 100 parts per million nitrogen. And that works great for the vegetative growth and managing that. What it may not be sufficient enough for are the micronutrients, okay? So most of your bagged feeds out there, they're designed to be fed at about 200 parts per million to get enough micronutrients in there, okay? So if you're feeding light with this crop, you may want to come in with a micronutrient supplement of some type to help bolster the micronutrient needs of that. We can see iron deficiency as well as others, and we can see boron deficiency. Okay, and that's what the picture I'm showing you here is. Now I'm going to talk about calcium and boron together. Boron, of course, is a micronutrient. We can get that through supplements, extra supplements if we need. Calcium, a lot of us rely upon our water. So if we have high alkaline water, we generally have high calcium water, and we rely upon that from the limestone in our potting soils. But as I mentioned, during young plants especially, or right after transplant, this is a tough time to grow plants because there's so much humidity around the growing tip. It's not allowing the transpiration to occur. So one of the things to think about on the nutrition side is, am I getting enough boron in my system? Okay. And again, if you're feeding at 100 parts per million, you're probably not. And do I have enough calcium in the system? So this is where supplemental feed with a CalMag type fertilizer may help with the calcium, but you may need the micronutrient supplement. Okay, what else to consider? Let's talk about plant growth regulators, because we've been talking about trying to make the plants grow, get enough nutrients, but what if we start to grow them a little too aggressively? What if our temperatures are warmer and it's brighter than we're used to seeing in our greenhouse? Then what do? We can use plant growth regulators, and plant growth regulators, I feel, should be used in the young plant stage for the most part to help control this. If you look at the technical bulletins, there's quite a few plant growth regulators that work. There's not always really good information out there on, okay, which one, what rate. So I'll just share with you some of the things I've seen. Now, this goes back to you need to trial, you need to read and understand the labels, just as you should with with the fungicides we discussed earlier. But if you're new to start out with this and want to try it, try a bonsai spray at two parts per million. That's a good, safe place to start. Yes, you can overdo it with too much volume. You can overdo it if the temperatures are too cold. All those environmental factors come into play, but that's a place you could start to explore to see if the plant growth regulators work right for you. And that's what it's going to take. We're going to have to manage all of these things together, the nutrition, the temperature, the PGRs, to get in the water management, to get nice tone growth is what we want. So what do we do next? Let's talk about finishing this plant, okay? And really, this is just this harmonious, I call it toning, okay? It's the interaction of your water management, your nutrition, and your PGR to get a nice, strong plant, well branched, but not flimsy and floppy. We want it to hold up if we have to do any shipping. We want it to hold up for the consumer to get it to their home. So this is what we're going to do. The water management. Again, that 4-to-2 water, wet to dry strategy is really good. And we can just kind of veer on each side depending if we need the plant larger or smaller. Nutrition. Okay. Impatiens respond tremendously well to nitrogen and a decent amount of phosphorus. So can you restrict phosphorus to restrict growth? You can, but you kind of run the risk of causing a problem later on. I really like to target 5 to 10 parts per million phosphorus in the soil. And then I like to use the nitrogen variability to give me that extra growth if I want. So as I said, 100 parts per million is usually sufficient. If you need them to grow a little bit, hey, a punch of a fertilizer such as 20-10-20 with a decent amount of ammoniacal nitrogen at 150 parts per million, that's going to give you ample growth with an Impatien. I have seen some folks go even higher to 250, but you run the risk of elevating your EC too much in that regard. Okay, just to stay similar with the recommendation I had to suggest trialing in young plants, I'm going to stick with bonsai as a plant growth regulator to trial here. But notice what I've done here. We've got a little bit larger plant. We've got more tissue to cover. Okay, I'm going to recommend you step up after transplant stage or after that, 7 to 8 true leaf stage and go a little bit higher rate. The reason I'm choosing to suggest bonsai here is because I've seen growers be able to effectively use this spray without too much delay in flowering, which you might see with some of the other ones. A little bit more forgiving than maybe Sue Magic, but more active than a B9. So again, I'm kind of just going in the middle of the road here. Think about this though. You can spray 5 parts per million bonsai at a nice light rate over the top, or you can spray it really heavy. That's two big differences in the amount of active ingredient you've actually got on the plant. So really tune in your plant growth regulator applications and get that honed in and get it consistent from week to week, crop to crop, so you're able to fine tune your production even better. And I'm going to finish up with something I think is one of the fun parts of growing a crop like Impatiens, and that's plant on schedule. Okay. This is one where you need to work with the product representatives from the breeding companies to really target this in. But, as I showed pictures, we can use this in small pack materials or high density packs. We can use this in large patio containers or combo containers. If we start them too early, the cool temperatures, the low light can really slow the crop down as compared to a crop we start a little bit later in the year. So this is one where I encourage you to do your homework on how many plants are you going to use in the final container? What do you want them to look like? What's your strategy? Do you want to stomp on them on PGR or do you want to have to push them? It really depends on your personal strategy, but it's one that you can have a lot of fun and manipulate and make the crop look just fine. So with that, Bill, I think that kind of covers the highlights of Impatiens 2.0.
Excellent. You gave a lot of really good information. It's funny, 5 or 6 years ago, I had my entire bed of Impatiens taken out by downy mildew, and I got really scared, and I didn't plant them. I went to New Guineas for the next few years, and then this past year, I did plant beacons, and it was just nice to have Impatiens back. And I think that consumers, gardeners, landscapers, everybody's happy to have this kind of garden workhorse, this shade garden staple back in the repertoire. So Thank you so much for spending some time in the break room covering this important topic. You covered it from many different angles, from choosing the resistant genetics, following the protocols to stay clean all the way through growth and finishing. Clearly, there are steps that growers can take to have success with this critical crop, right?
Absolutely. It is a critical crop for us, and so thankful to have it back on the bench again.
Absolutely. So real quick before we close, just a reminder that all the videos from this series are posted to growertalks.com/tech-on-demand. And thank you all for your interest in this series. The clicks, the downloads, the likes have really been tremendous. So thank you so much for all of your attention to the listeners and viewers out there. So that's it for today. On behalf of Todd, I'm Bill Calkins with Ball Tech on Demand, wishing you all the best. Take care.
Bye-bye.